have a confession to make. I'm here to talk about Kingston Station, but I'm not really a swamper, as the residents of South Kingstown are often called. No, I came to Rhode Island in 1969. Other than a dreadful and mostly horrible freshman year at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York. I was born in San Francisco, and all of my relatives came from San Francisco, and I spent my entire life on the West Coast until 1969. Now, I was well acquainted with trains, however, because my father was a doctor, and he worked for the Southern Pacific Railroad at its hospital in San Francisco. Now, as a result of that, we had a family railroad pass, and so we could travel anywhere on the West Coast for nothing. And I took advantage of that to travel all over the West. And I did a little calculating. I figured, depending on the date, I might actually have been conceived on a train. Not in a coach, however, but in one of the sleeping cars.
Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, I'm glad. So how did it happen that I came to Rhode Island? For a variety of reasons, when I finished my education, I went up and did postdoctoral work in Seattle, Washington, for a couple of years. And at that time, there were a lot of college faculty jobs available, but I had a bunch of other stuff going on. And by the time I was available to take a job, there was only one that was open, and it was at the University of Rhode Island, which, as I thought, was someplace at the tip of Long Island. So after I accepted the job, naturally, I took the train cross country to get to Rhode Island. Now, the train from Seattle to Chicago was wonderful. It was spectacular. From Chicago to New York City, it was all right. But then after I got off at the station in New York, I found the platform on which the train going up to Kingston was waiting, and I looked at all these horrible old cars, and on the side of each one there was written cattle, pigs, horses. So I got on the first available one, and it didn't take as long as I thought it would to get up to Kingston. It was only 3 or 4 days. And I finally got here, and I had heard that there was a very quaint little Victorian wooden train station there. So the train screeched to a halt. I stood at the top of the train stairs, and I looked out, and I saw this dump. It was painted sort of a dung colored with horse piss trim. It was awful, but it did say Kingston. So I almost got back on the train back to New York, but I didn't. I got off. And my new department chair, because I got a job at the University of Rhode Island, picked me up and took me up to Kingston. And I had read about all these quaint New England college towns, and so I started looking around for the bookstores and the little restaurants and the coffee shops, and what I saw was cows. So I had apparently gone from living in the most sophisticated city in the world to living in greasy corner Rhode Island. Well, despite I got my forebodings, I got off the train, but it didn't take me long to adapt. Over the phone, the URI recruiter had said that I might have a large class for my first class. Now, I don't know what a large class is to you, but this was 920 students in Edwards Auditorium. Ooh. But being a natural-born ham, I adapted to that pretty quickly and got used to it, and soon had time to explore the rail scene in Rhode Island. Now, I found out that the Penn Central, which was then the dominant railroad in Rhode Island, had an engine facility in North Providence, in a neighborhood that sort of looked like the one that was in West Side Story, if you remember that. Well, nothing like that would stop a real fan, so I took a trip up. It was like visiting a railroad Jurassic Park. All these ancient, run-down locomotives. But after a year or two, things sort of settled down, and I started to take train trips again, this time for professional reasons. There are still quite a few trains stopping at Kingston, so I got well acquainted with Kingston Station. And every trip convinced me even more that Kingston Station was not projecting the image that the then very ambitious University of Rhode Island was trying to convey. Well, it turns out I wasn't the only one who was dismayed by the condition of Kingston Station. In 1972, an ad appeared in the student newspaper asking for people who were interested in working on refurbishing the station to go to a meeting. Now, there were two people who set up this initial ad. The Reverend John Hall, who was the Episcopal chaplain at URI, and Barbara Durham, who was the wife of a URI economics professor. So, there was one thing that I think was essential to the success of this group. So many of its members were associated with a university, and a university is a bureaucracy. And if you want to be successful at a university, you've got to be successful in negotiating around bureaucracies. Well, the group, this new group, came to be called the Friends of the Kingston Station. And it had a rude awakening when it came time to trying to find out who owned the station to ask for permission to work on it. The station was awash in bureaucracies. For example, it wasn't as easy to find out who to contact to ask for permission as you might think. The station actually had been built in 1875 by the New York, Providence, and Boston Railroad. And it had been absorbed by the New York, New Haven, and Hartford, which was colloquially known as the New Haven. Now, the New Haven turned belly up in 1968. This was only a couple of years before its corpse was taken over by the Penn Central Railroad, which then died in 1970, which was the same year that Amtrak was formed. Confused? So was everybody on the early Friends of the Kingston Station. It turned out that Amtrak owned the tracks that ran the trains that ran through the station, but the station itself was currently owned by Penn Central, although at some point it would be taken over by Amtrak, which would turn it over to the Rhode Island Department of Transportation, which in turn had several divisions which divided up the functions of the station. Are you still confused? All right, well, that's all right. Let me straighten it out for you with an example. Now, being a very busy place, there was a need for policing, right? Policing. But who was going to write the traffic tickets and collect the revenue? The Amtrak police? The Rhode Island Department of Transportation police? Or the South Kingstown police? They all raised their heads and said, I will. So the Friends called a meeting to try to decide this. And after only about 15 hours, going back and forth, it got worked out. And so this was the kind of background the original Friends had to work within to try to plan the first citizen-run restoration. All parties agreed that volunteers would be permitted to do all the exterior work on the station, including scraping the lead paint off the outside walls. That was all right. Hanging off extension ladders, provided they had sufficient insurance, which, of course, the early Friends had to pay for. Amtrak would buy the exterior paint and do the interior restoration with its own people. Oh, wait a minute. Amtrak was heavily unionized. So in any discussions, we had to have union representatives. And so we eventually got it down to two union folks. One was a safety inspector, and the other was a flagman. Now the safety inspector was basically there to make sure that we didn't somehow blow ourselves up. And the flagman was there to make sure that people stood away from the tracks when a train went through. That was the only thing they had to do while drawing full pay. So we set up a card table in the middle of the station, and they whiled away their time playing poker. Local grocery stores provided all the food for the volunteer workers, and there were 180 people from the community who came in and worked for a whole week on the station. Now, it's hard to imagine that in today's litigious, internet-dominated society that something like that could ever be done again. Well, just about a month after the completion of the restoration, the first of the many celebrations at this station was done. The Kingston station is full of celebrations going all the way back. That was our reward to ourselves for doing all that work. And so we got to have a celebration. Well, most of those celebrations tried to mimic the celebration at the completion of the first transcontinental railroad in Promontory Point, Utah, where two engines, one from the east and one from the west, touched noses at the point. So we tried to recreate that as best as possible for Kingston Station. Now, what all these occasions, these celebrations had in common was that they gave an opportunity for local politicians to claim credit for their contributions to the effort, which they were more than delighted to do. And so we were happy to help them out on that, because who knows, they might help us out again. Now, the 1974 celebration was noted by the touching of noses of two trains. One of the trains came down from Providence, and it was composed of cars owned by the state of Rhode Island and run on the last commuter train that was operated by the state, 501. So on that train, the governor, both senators, second district congressmen, Amtrak executives, everybody else. Now the other train that came up to touch noses with it in Kingston was a little tiny train that came in on the tracks of the Narragansett Pier Railroad, which was still running at the time. And it consisted, this train, not exactly a train, consisted of a little tiny diesel locomotive and an 1885 wooden coach that was used by the Narragansett Pier Railroad for its tourist trains. Now, the thing was that on board this train, they had Amtrak officials, Narragansett Pier officials, and the Friends. But this car had a liquor license because they used it in the tourist trains coming in from Wakefield. And so it took about an hour to get from Peacedale up to Kingston Station. And by the time we got there, everybody was pretty mellow. So a few hours later, the two trains arrived in Kingston, and Governor Noel, remember him, issued a proclamation declaring July the 2nd, Friends of Kingston Railroad Day. Now, a couple of members of the Friends were aware that there was something called the National Register of Historic Places. Okay? And so they did. They looked it up. And they went through all the horrendous amount of paperwork to get the station listed on the National Register of Historic Places. They didn't know it at the time, but that act meant that we have a station today. And I'll tell you why that might have had a different outcome. Now, after the celebrations were over, the Friends disbanded. The station, which was now owned by the Rhode Island Department of Transportation, then went through a long, slow decline. It never became the showplace that the original Friends had hoped it would. However, on December 12, 1988, a near disaster happened that later turned out to have a wildly beneficial effect. The cause is still unknown. It might have been a cigarette, it might have been an electrical short, but early on the morning of December 12th, a fire started on the north end of the station. Early in the morning. The volunteer fire department arrived in very short order, but the entire north end of the station was completely burned out, and there was a huge hole in the roof. Well, what do we do now? Amtrak immediately sent some engineering people down to look at the station to decide what could be done and what be needed to repair it. Their first response was to set up a temporary ticket office in the South Wing, which was relatively undamaged. But some of those early Amtrak people had a much better idea as far as they were concerned. It went like this. We have a stop in Providence. We have a stop in Westerly. We're not a commuter line. So why don't we just tear Kingston Station down and eliminate the stop? People from South Kingston who want to take an Amtrak train, they can drive 20 minutes down to Westerly. Well, when this idea was proposed to the ticket agent and also a member of the Friends named Jack McCabe, he went through the documents that were still left in the unburnt part of the station, and he pulled out the certificate placing the building on the National Register of Historic Places. A structure on the National Register may not be torn down for any reason. So the Amtrak guys, they knew that, and they blanched, and they said, well, okay, we're not going to tear it down, but what are they going to do instead? The problem was that the National Register didn't provide a significant amount of funds to improve a structure's position on the register. So the Friends revived itself again and started to look for money to kind of restore the station and improve it again. Well, 100 grand here, 100 grand there, no problem. But a local architect named Kevin Monroe calculated that it would take a couple of $100 grand just to repair the fire damage, let alone actually improve the station. So that was a problem. By this time, however, there were several Friends members who were politically involved in Rhode Island, which is what you have to be in Rhode Island to get anything done, as we have now learned, including a young man who worked in Senator Chafee's office. He discovered that there was a new buzz concept in the Federal Department of Transportation. It was called intermodal. And the idea was that the federal government would facilitate projects and structures that would be designed to make it easier for people to go from one mode of transportation to another. It's intermodal. Now, nowhere did it say why this was a good idea and why it should be supported. It just was there. So, as far as I can figure out, the real idea of intermodal was simply to get people out of their cars and then get them to a position where they could go from their car at the station and then take the train to someplace else. Well, so the Friends sponsored a study that suggested that with a few bucks, well, more than a few bucks, Kingston Station could be made into a true intermodal facility. One huge plus was the idea that the new bike path went by the station. That guaranteed that this thing would be intermodal. If you lived in Wakefield, you'd never have to take your car to go into Boston. You could take the bike path. Take the bike path up to Kingston Station and then take a train. Now, of course, that was assuming that you were in superb shape and it wasn't snowing. But we forgot about that. In the late 80s and early 90s, some concrete sources of money were identified. And there was a lot of money available for intermodal improvements. And it wasn't exactly clear what these were. You could sort of define it any way you wanted in order to get the money in. So a parking lot is an intermodal facility. A bathroom is an intermodal facility. So if you're making plans to upgrade your station, all you had to do was upgrade your bathrooms, and that would be taken out of intermodal money. The '80s and the '90s brought a huge number of other changes around the station, most of which the station was only a bystander. For example, the Amtrak trains, or the Acela trains, started to go through Kingston. Well, before that, if you wanted to take a southbound train and you were in the station, you just walk across the tracks and get on board the southbound train. Well, you couldn't do that with the Acela trains going through. So how would you get from one side of the track to the other? An overpass. $3 million. Well, handicapped regulations started to come through. There couldn't be any stairs between the floor of the station and the floor of the railroad car. So that meant that what you had to do was jack the station up off its foundation, move it 50 feet away, put in new platforms, and then move the station back. That's why you can occasionally see these weird pictures of Kingston Station on stilts 50 feet away from the station. That was what that was about. Now, to date, almost $30 million have been spent on Kingston Station and its surroundings. And most of that money has stayed in the community. Well, the Friends originally had about 180 dues-paying members, and that number decreased over the course of the years. But toward the middle of the 90s, it became clear that there needed to be another celebration to mark a completion of something. So the Friends got together and planned a new celebration that would involve 2 locomotives meeting in front of the station. Well, this time it was done, we decided that we would get a steam locomotive and have it meet a new diesel engine in front of the station. Where were we going to get a steam engine? Well, we went down to the Valley Railroad in Essex, Connecticut. And I went down there, and a bunch of Amtrak guys went down there. And we made arrangements to meet the chief engineer of the Valley Railroad, and we told him what we wanted to do. It turned out he was a swamp Yankee. He said, I don't know as I want to let my engine go on your Amtrak tracks. The last time I rode Amtrak, I was airborne half the time out of my seat because your tracks were so rough. Well, the Amtrak guys were all upset about this. So they arranged a special train to be done. Long story short, we finally arranged in 1998 to have a huge celebration with a steam engine and Amtrak's latest diesel engine meeting in front of the station with over 3,000 visitors from the community. Well, now we come to toward the end of it, and this is something I have to be a little careful about, but I think a lot of people want to know something about it. How many of you have visited the Railroad Museum when it was still going? Okay, remember the Railroad Museum? Well, in 2012, the Friends of the Station set up a railroad museum in the unused south room of the station. And it was a wild success. We got the community chipped in, Amtrak chipped in, everybody chipped in. And by 2015, it was the most popular small museum in the state of Rhode Island. Here is where I have to be a little careful. In 2015, the museum was shut down, closed. Why? Well, a person who worked for the state had the idea that if they got rid of the museum, they could convert the museum space into a second waiting room for the station and then charge Amtrak more for rent. And the Friends of the Station had gotten a $300,000 grant for improvements. This was commandeered to make the conversion. Well, I was curious how that worked out. So I looked, and as of 5 years ago, the state of Rhode Island didn't make any money from the use of that space. No, it was before. It's all for nothing. Okay. So that killed the museum, and essentially it killed the Friends too, because we didn't really have anything more to do, and we were all getting old. And so gradually the Friends drifted away as their average age increased and their duties decreased. Later on, the organization reformed into a new group. It was still called the Friends of the Kingston Station, but it was devoted to try to fix up the Kingston Railroad Tower. They also became, the surviving members, became participants in the South Kingston 300 celebration, which is why I'm here. Now, Kingston Station has played a huge role in my life and in the life of this community for over 40 years. I'm delighted that the tens of thousands of hours of volunteer work have paid off so handsomely for the community and for the many other people who come to treasure the beautiful old Kingston Station. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and if there are any questions,
I think we're here with everybody. The theme tonight, we're going to continue with that. This will be much shorter. I only have about 5 or 10 minutes that I can spend with you. But the theme stays consistent with historic preservation. You probably heard from Frank, and if you're going to listen in with Judge Indalia's discussion around historic preservation, there's a few key elements that make for a good and successful historic preservation project. You've got the people, right? All of the volunteers that come together and devote so many hours of their time. You've got a willing landowner. That's important. We've heard that there are some difficulties with the Kingston station because of the landowner and the state ownership. You've got, what else? Money. Right? It often requires some resources in order to get things going. So people, willing landowner, money, these are all very important elements, and we're going to talk about those a little bit in a moment. What I'd like to talk to you about and introduce to you is a little bit around the HDC, the Historic District Commission for the town of South Kingston. And this is a plug. This is an unabashed plug for what we are doing to, number one, educate, but also to invite as many as you feel comfortable to get involved and participate, because this is a public entity. We have volunteers that make this happen, and hopefully some of the things that we talk about tonight and introduce to you will get you jazzed up about historic preservation. So what is the historic preservation? What does the HDC do in the town of South Kingstown? One thing it does is you're sitting in the midst of it. You're in the middle of the Kingston Historic District, one of the oldest, if not the oldest, historic district in the state of Rhode Island. And the role of the Kingston, the Historic District Commission is to take applications by residents in the historic district for alterations to their building. So if they want to change a window, they want to put storm windows in, they want to re-roof, or in some cases, like we have right down the road on South Road, somebody wants to build a new house. That, of course, is limited because we don't have too many vacant lots where somebody can build a new house. But we do occasionally get those. So when that happens, the HDC has to apply the standards of the Department of Interior and Park Service to evaluate whether or not that change can go forward, and give some advice and help the property owners to make those adjustments in line with the standards. So that's the one thing. The other things that we do are things that you probably don't know about because it's less associated with the HDC. When people think of the HDC, they think of Kingston. And it's a wonderful example of early 19th century buildings. But we've got a treasure trove of historic and cultural resources spread throughout the town of South Kingstown, in all of our other villages and in between. So one of the, I left it over there just a moment. Pull that for me. One of the foundational things that we want to do is to update our database of historic resources. So some of you may be familiar with this document. It was last printed in 1984 by the Rhode Island Preservation Commission. This is the basis for a lot of the work that we do in the town. It identifies the importance of architectural and historic resources. But it's 40 years old. If we consider those structures to be 50 years or older to be historic, we already have a new generation of buildings that we haven't accounted for. So the HDC is looking to update, remove in some cases where we've had demolished buildings, add where we have other buildings that should be considered. So that's one thing that we're doing. Another thing that we're doing is we recently got a grant, a certified local government grant, to do a study on Matunic. And this is kind of interesting because it's in line with a lot of the things that we think about today around climate change. So what are the impacts of climate change to the historical resources in Matunic? We're hoping to move that forward in the next few months, and stay tuned for some of the results coming out of that. We also have a really interesting program that we're putting in place. So as I mentioned, we've got this great Kingston Historic District with all the protections that it has towards historic structures, and all of these historic structures are combined in a village. But what about protection for all of those other houses? What are all of those other structures that are disparately placed, maybe not even in a distinct village? What we're doing is looking at what's called a landmark district. And a landmark district will allow, on a voluntary basis, owners of those properties to come forward and say, look, I really care about my property. I want it to have that same protection. So they go through an application process, and that property can have the same level of protection, and you'd also be able to leverage many of the benefits and resources that come with owning a historic property. So very excited to be able to roll that out. I think we're nearing the end of the time, so I'm going to cut this real short by ending with a little bit of the segue that Frank set me up with. Another thing, and I'm switching hats to the Kingston, Friends of the Kingston Railroad Station, another thing that we're looking at is the protection of the old signal tower. If you've driven by Route 138 in the last 10 years, you've seen this really decrepit structure that gets worse and worse with the roof just caving in. That structure was at one time one of many, many signal towers up and down the New Haven line. They're very simple in nature, which is why there aren't very many of them left over anymore. They're not real sturdy, but they do have historic significance. They are a reflection of our railroad history and hopefully a legacy for the future folks to understand what it was to man a signal tower. So we're working on trying to resolve that. Going back to that chemistry, what makes up a successful historic preservation project? People, right? We've got people that are interested in it. A willing landowner or a property owner. We don't have that. The state of Rhode Island at this point is not being real cooperative with us in our attempts to restore that. So we need some change. We need some change to happen there. It could come from political pressure. All of you here, that's what you're responsible for, is to create political pressure for those things that are important to you. So keep your fingers crossed. If you'd like to, ample opportunities to get involved in historic preservation, whether that be on the Historic District Commission or participating with one of the nonprofits that advocates for historic preservation in the town of South Kingston. And thank you very much. I